Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a wine from the Languedoc in southern France. So this is Chateau de Lascaux. The wine is simply labelled as a Languedoc, while on the back here it's described as Garrigue Blanc 2022. So this is a blended wine, a cuvée of theirs. Now, I think it's not unusual to consider the Languedoc as a supplier of great value wines, good quality, particularly when you're thinking about robust reds. But I don't think we think so much about the white wines from that area. I suppose Pic de Pinet, that sort of sharp, simple, thirst-quenching sort of wine might come to mind. But actually there are some sort of lovely, richer, fuller styles that are well worth considering, and I hope this is going to prove to be one of them. Now, Chateau de Lascaux, really interesting in terms of its history. The Cavalier family who own it trace their origins back in this little tiny town of Vacquières, back to the 16th century, in fact to 1530, when Gaucent Cavalier was recorded in records kept at the local priory as owning a farm. It was seen as a mixed farm, but certainly viticulture was mentioned as part of what they did there. But probably it's supposed just making wine to supply their own drinking needs, not necessarily for sale. Today, it's an 85-hectare estate, still run by the same family, the Cavalier family, 15 generations later. In fact, it was in the 1800s, the 1850s, that Joseph-Henri Cavalier chose to focus the energies of their farming on grape growing and winemaking. It may not have been the greatest of decisions at the time, because not long after he decided to do this in the 1850s, the oidium epidemic hit this area and the vineyards were very hard hit. Fairly soon after that, in the 1870s, phylloxera came to the area in about 1874, so the period 1874 to 1878 saw the vineyards completely ravaged. In the end, they all had to be pulled up and replanted. So not a fortuitous time to have been a vigneron in this area. Now, the next date I have here historically is 1984, when Jean-Benoit Cavalier takes over his family estate, and Jean-Benoit sets out to modernise. So the way he does this is he starts in the vineyards and he chooses more modern, more popular grape varieties to plant. He uses higher planting densities. He finds new areas to plant. He ends up rebuilding the cellars. He's really focusing on quality, and part of that focus takes him in the direction that in 2009 they gained organic certification for their grape growing, and then in 2018 they gained biodynamic certification. So what does this mean? It's the idea of trying not only to avoid using pesticides, herbicides and fertilizers that are produced in factories and non-organic, but also the idea of trying to harness the vigour, the fertility and the biodiversity of the soils and of the region to improve the life forces of the vineyard and produce better wines that way. Now, here we're in an area called the Pic Saint-Loup. It's in the northern part of the Languedoc, so about at least 20 kilometres inland from the Mediterranean. The vineyard's here at about 130 metres above sea level, but we're before you really get into the foothills of the Cevennes mountains. The vineyards all face southeast, and the soil types are a deep combination of clays and limestone. So in places they're fractured limestone, in other places they're clay marls, in other places they're deep clay. But the similarity of all these soils is that they're really quite good at holding water. So when it's relatively arid in the summers here, which it is, the soils, the clays, the limestones provide good water reservoirs for the vines to work from. Average vine age here is about 20 years, so this is the replanting that's gone on. These vines are now reaching a level of maturity. The biodynamic practices in the vineyard see them using lots of compost, lots of manure, using medical preparations created as tinctures of things like nettle tea, chamomile, comfrey. They'll apply silica to the vineyards and use a biodynamic preparation that's referred to as a horn dung, where you bury animal manure in horns, and that's supposed to energize it. So yes, the name Garrigue comes from the fact that all these vineyards are clearings in the Garrigue. I've seen Garrigue translated as forest, but in general it's not so much forest as more sort of scrub or bush. Yes, there are sort of oaks and pine trees, etc. But there's also a lot of sort of wild herbs. You see lavender and rosemary, that sort of thing, growing wild in the Garrigue. As I say, today they have 85 hectares, and these various plots are actually scattered. They're not all in one location, but they're all within 10 kilometres of the winery, so they're relatively easy for the family to access and manage. Now, picking here goes on both with a machine and by hand. That depends on the plot. The fruit on arrival at the winery is destemmed, and the crushed fruit is allowed to soak. It has a cold soak for a brief cold soak, just to extract fruit aromas from the grapes without the presence of alcohol, so you're getting more delicate perfumes and fruit notes there. The juice, once it's been pressed, is allowed to settle, and that settles out the solids and allows fermentation to go ahead. Fermentation goes ahead in stainless steel tanks. The tanks are temperature regulated, but temperature is allowed to go up to about 18 degrees, so giving a relatively warm, fairly rich ferment there. After fermentation, the wine stays in these tanks until it's bottled, and bottling goes on somewhere between December of that year and the March of the following year. So there's very little time spent aging here. There's no presence of oak, so it's very much a showcasing of the fruit and the aromas that they've managed to take out of it. So looking at the wine, it's pale yellow, and as I swirl it, it's forming tears fairly readily on the glass. To examine the aromas, they're rich, they're tropical. There's a combination of two aspects really. There's a sort of a slightly estery, high-toned banana note, a very high ripeness, and then there's a sort of rich stone fruit, almost like sort of ripe apricot, nectarine, that sort of, you know, nice and concentrated below the more lifted banana estery notes. So let's have a taste, shall we? On the palate, those sort of slightly confected, more banana notes are more present at the beginning of the palate. The stone fruit notes aren't quite as ripe. There's not so much of the ripe apricot. It's more sort of a delicate, fresh, peachy note. There are perhaps hints of citrus, a touch of lemon, a touch of grapefruit, but that having been said, the acidity is not particularly steely or tart. There's actually quite a sort of a softness to the acidity. So there's enough freshness to lift the fruit at the beginning, but it's not really a particularly high acid wine. It's soft, gentle, approachable. I mean, it's completely dry, but there's a lovely ripeness to the fruit there. The fruit flavour at the same time aren't particularly complex. There's no layer of cedar or vanilla or something like that to alter it. It is just that sort of lovely, rounded, attractive, perfumed fruit. There are some nice notes in there. I mean, just a passion fruit coming through, that sort of thing, but not any great complexity. The acidity is sufficient to give reasonable length, but there's not a very long finish. And through there again is where perhaps you're seeing the more delicate peach notes and citric freshness coming through. The alcohol is balanced, it's rounding, it's giving a rounded sort of rich, slight warmth to the mid palate, but the alcohol's not particularly dominant, and it's not overpowering the fruit. It's more that the fruit simply peters out. So you know, an enjoyable wine, very approachable and very easy drinking. Not of any great complexity, not particularly for aging. Like I say, good value, everyday drinking. So thank you very much for joining us. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, do please press the like button. If you're watching more of these tastings, it would be great if you'd sign up and follow us. That would be fantastic. If you have any comments, we'd love to see them in the comments box below. And in the notes below, you'll also find there's a link to the Wine Searcher website where you can find out more about this wine. You can find out its pricing, where it's available, and more details along those lines. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, please do feel free to pass it on to them. But most importantly, it would be great if you could find some time to come and join us for another tasting again in the near future. Thanks again. Bye for now.